Okay, so the next one is why have private members? And so this one is kind of like commenting, right? It doesn't seem very useful when you're working by yourself, but it's more so when you're working with other people or when you don't want somebody to change your code. But it's basically like it's trying to make it harder to change the private variables in case you're not actually trying to change them. Like when you're working with other people, you don't want them to actually change some of these variables by accident, or when you're working with like if you're like developing software or whatever, you don't need the user accidentally or clients accidentally like changing some of these variables. So why have private members? Basically, and I will write that on here, it protects critical data from being accidentally modified or used in a way that might change the object. So you basically just trying to protect it from other people or even yourself, just to protect important variables. Okay. So the next question I have is what's a constructor? So a constructor is basically a function that is called immediately when you define a new object within a class, like a new object of the class type, right? And so it's gonna run immediately when it's called, and it's gonna do whatever you tell it to do. So a constructor is a member function that is called automatically when you define something with a class type, aka create a new class object. And I think I misspelled this. Yeah, they're like, oh, I've got the S. Okay. Anyways, so that's what a constructor does. And so why would we potentially think about needing to use a constructor? Well, it kind of just depends on what you're trying to do. But let's say you want everything to start out a certain way in for your specific class. And so this is a good way to just immediately set everything to the numbers you want, like 0, like you want to immediately set everything to 0, or however you want. Why would we want to use a constructor? Because constructors are useful when you want a new class object to have certain specifications right off the bat. How would you declare a constructor? Okay, well, a constructor is also when you declare a constructor, since you want it to be called immediately, you call it the same name as your class. So if we were going based off class name up here, so like let's say we had, oops, I forgot the class. Class name, and then call public, and then so your constructor it's the class name again. So it's class name, open parentheses, and then a semicolon, and that is your entire constructor. And then once again, you can define it within your class, or you can also define it outside your class, in which case it looked like class name, oops, and then it'd have whatever you want to do. So like, let's say we were trying to get the inputs for X and Y, you could automatically take in X and Y. We could automatically take an X and set Y to be equal to 0 or 1. It really just depends on what you want to do, but that is how you set a constructor. Okay, so how do constructors with parameters work? So they work almost the exact same way as regular constructors, except you're gonna have parameters within here. So what it's gonna look like inside the class function is it's going to look kind of like let's say we were back right here. So I'm just gonna pretend like we're already in the function. I mean in the class. And let's say we wanted it to take you know, and okay, so like let's say we wanted it to take like an integer, we could do just int, or let's say we also want to take a double. So you don't actually put the actual variable names in here unless you're defining the class within your class. Otherwise you just leave it out, and you'd put the variables when you're running it like outside of the class. So like class name int x comma double y, and let's like pretend we have stuff within those brackets, and then the only difference is when you have a constructor with parameters, when you're doing something in a side main. So a regular constructor would, if we did class name test2 inside, say this is inside main, it would automatically run the constructor. You don't have to put anything else into it. So I'm actually gonna, so this is for a constructor without parameters. A constructor with parameters would look like, constructor without parameters would look like this. Then you'd open your parentheses just like you're passing arguments into a function. It's the same thing. So I'm just gonna put like variable 1 comma variable 2 because we don't really know what they are. And so that is how you would pass it into the constructor, because it runs immediately, right? And so if it was following this, right, variable 1 would have to be an integer, variable 2 would have to be a double. So you have to make sure that those line up. But this part is the same as a function, and this part is almost the same as declaring a variable, right? But just remember, when you have parameters with constructors with parameters, you have to pass in the arguments when you declare the object. So my last question is, can you initialize variables within a class? And the answer is yes. So if you were to have these variables within a class, like private, and you wanted like an int x, and you could set it equal to whatever you wanted, but when you're doing this, that's usually what the constructor is for. So you usually want a constructor to call this. bosses to just do what's called in-place member initialization. So you can do this, but you can also just use a constructor.